Hello everyone, my name is Bodie Thorpe and I'm doing a Master of Public Health and International Development at Trobe University. And for my book review for the subject, Social and Cultural Perspectives in Public Health, I've decided to review the book Death Without Weeping, The Violence of Everyday Life in Brazil by Nancy Scheper-Hughes. This book was published in 1992 by Nancy Scheper-Hughes, who is a professor of medical and socio-cultural anthropology at the University of California in Berkeley. She's completed much research on suffering, violence, and premature death, and has published many scholarly articles as well as many other books. So she's a highly regarded academic in her field. Most of her work is from personal accounts, and this book is exactly the same. She wrote this book after over a 20-year period after spending much time in Brazil. Initially, she was there as a Peace Corps worker in the mid-60s and returned later 4 times, in fact, in the 80s, as a mother with her family and as an anthropologist to do some more research on the people and the community she worked in back in the mid-60s. So she wrote this book really as an expose of the violence of the everyday life in Brazil, and in particular the premature death of children and the infant mortality in that society of northeastern Brazil. She wrote this in a favela, which is a shantytown called Bom Jesus, which is in the Alto de Cruzeiro area of northeastern Brazil. And for those who don't know Brazil, the northeastern part is one of the more impoverished areas of Brazil. The key points and issues of this book, however, are actually quite broad, and it's quite a large, thick book, and there's a whole lot of issues in there, and she looks at a lot of them, and not just the infant death, but infant death is certainly one, and she looks at it from a struggle of survival point of view, and links that to the chronic and sometimes acute and chronic hunger of the area, and what she refers to in the book and what the locals call the delirio de fome, which is the delirium of hunger, and the irony of the fact that they're in a rural area in sugarcane fields, and how, despite the fact that they're growing sugarcane, that they are going hungry. She looks in depth at the mother love instinct, and how acceptance of the mothers of the children's dying in this area was seemed to be abnormal, and goes against the grain of the universal mother love theory of the parental instincts to protect children. The mothers were unwilling to look after the weak children and would sacrifice the weak children to look after themselves and the strong children, and this was sort of commonplace, and how this was also coupled with a high fertility rate. So despite the fact that children were dying, they were conceiving more and more children. She also looks at the relationship of extreme poverty to the premature death, and the fact that there's no food, there's no work, no opportunity, education, coupled with pollution, drought, and despite all that, the high fertility rate. She looks at violence in the forms of ritualized killings. The time she was there, Brazil was controlled by a military coup, and to get kids off the streets, sometimes they would just kill people and take them away. And then there's organ trafficking going on because of the vulnerability of the people in this area. Due to their extreme poverty, they would be taken and their organs harvested. And also the human trafficking. Some of the better looking children would be taken away and offered for adoption, and invariably ended up overseas. She also looks at worker exploitation and how the big farms would exploit the poor people for their labour and wouldn't pay them properly, in particular the exploitation of women for cheap labour. how the declining workforce with the increase of technology further affected the poverty of the area. She also looks at religion and culture. Religion and culture, and Brazil's a predominantly Roman Catholic country, and looks at the church's views on contraception and how that was affecting the high fertility rate, which was in turn affecting the high infant mortality rate. She looked at the male dominance in the culture, and the culture of survival in context to the chronic hunger. And lastly, she looks at government corruption, and how early efforts to get community groups together and education was seen by the military dictators as uprisings, and weren't allowed to continue, and looks at other political repression of the citizens, and the fact that there was no government protection of children, and there was no national health care before 1989, and there was no respect in death, that people were put into mass graves, shallow graves, and then exhumed to make way for more people, and how some people were used post-death as in medical research without their consent, and that there was no respect in death because they were just seen as poor people without any rights. So critically, I guess, this book is actually a really great expose of struggling human life in context to poverty and chronic hunger, and the child death in that area is certainly a huge issue that was good to have some attention brought to it. Interestingly, in that part of Brazil, the northeast area, accounted for 25% of all South American deaths at the time. So that's one region or one state of one country accounting for a quarter of the whole continent's deaths, and out of all the births in that region also, there was a 23% infant mortality rate, which is really quite horrific. So it was a good issue to expose to the world through writing a book. She really places the issue into context of what's happening around the issue, so the socio-political context of Brazil, the fact that this area is plagued by chronic hunger, the fact that agriculture couldn't sustain the populations, and by being there in the 60s and returning in the 80s, she could follow the plight of many people over the 20 years, and so by looking at the individuals over that period of time, that's how she built in all the other social issues into it, and so that's how she's ended up with such a really balanced and really interesting book full of issues related to poverty. But I like the way she's focused on the chronic hunger and also the infant mortality. She's really good also being an academic. She has read and is interested in a lot of literature on what she's studying, and she incorporates that into her book and references a lot of other people's work. So when she's trying to make an argument, she's very good at giving a balanced argument, and she talks about how her findings are very different to what's in the literature, and discusses those. So the book's a very balanced read, and I think is probably as non-biased as possible. And it certainly stops you having to put the book down and look up things to get a balanced view. I feel that reading the book, I was provided with that view by the author. From a discussion point of view, I found the hunger part really interesting, and looking at the limited anthropological works on hunger back post-World War II in concentration camps and then in African societies, a lot of it doesn't look at the mother and child relationship. So her findings are very interesting, and definitely looking at how the social unit is affected by chronic hunger was very confronting and very interesting, and how this rejects the instinct theory that the mother love is instinct. Certainly something that I think most of us tend to believe, that our parents will provide for us and go without. and this really questions that. So the delirio deforme she talks about, the mother instinct, is very interesting. So a question that I might ask you as the viewers is, do you think it's natural for mothers to abandon their children's needs? And do you think that it's normal for mothers to put their health before that of their children? I certainly hadn't ever thought of this as a question before reading the book, and so I think that's an interesting discussion point. So for an overall social contribution, I guess this book brings light to a very important issue, and issues that aren't just endemic to Brazil, but are probably repeated, or are repeated in countries all over the world. And this book, being Nancy being such an influential person in her field, has provided a great awareness of this issue. In terms of what it's done to help the issue, probably not a lot. Post writing this book, Brazil's become a democracy and taken a lot of steps in policy, and the democracy's certainly seen a lot of changes affect its citizens, and pulling, Brazil's renowned for pulling a lot of people above the poverty line. So, and the book probably didn't have anything to do with that, but she reflects upon what she did to help the community while she was there, and that's certainly very interesting. So she certainly has done some positive things, despite the fact that the book hasn't achieved them. Here are my references. I'll also put them in the comments section with the video. So thank you for watching.